Welcome, seekers of stories and keepers of memory, to Faces of History, the podcast where we stand in the echoes of the past, brush off the centuries of dust, and meet the men and women whose choices still shape the world we live in. I am your host, the Duke of New York, your guide through the tangled forests of forgotten time. Tonight, we walk the misty trails of the 18th century, across forests and rivers into the villages of the Iroquois Confederacy to meet a man known by many names to his people, Thayendanegea. To history, Joseph Brant, a warrior, a diplomat, a Christian convert, a cunning tactician, and for some, a symbol of betrayal. For others, the embodiment of loyalty to a way of life that the tides of empire threatened to wash away. Before he was a name feared on the frontier or whispered in council halls, Thayendanegea was a child of the longhouse, a son of the Wolf clan born into the great wooden lodges and forest trails of the Mohawk people. His story begins sometime around 1743 in a land of deep woods, rivers that shone like silver under the moon, and trails that linked villages across the vast domain of the Iroquois Confederacy, known to its own people as the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. To be Mohawk in the mid-18th century was to belong to one of the most powerful indigenous alliances on the continent. For generations, the Six Nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, had built a confederacy bound by the great law of peace, a vision of unity forged from warring clans who once hunted each other through the same forests. The Longhouse was more than a building. It was a symbol, a roof stretched wide enough to shelter many families, many nations, under one law. Within its smoky walls, children like Thayendanegea learned the stories of Sky Woman and the Peacemaker, of Hiawatha and the Sacred Tree of Peace. Little is written about Thayendanegea's earliest years, but we know the shape of a Mohawk boy's childhood. His mother, Margaret, a strong woman of the Wolf clan, would have taught him respect for the forest, for the spirits of the animals, for the cycle of seasons that bound their people to the land. His father, Peter, died while Joseph was still young. This loss shaped him. In the matrilineal Mohawk world, his clan ties and identity came through his mother, but a boy still needed the guidance of a male protector. His mother remarried a respected war chief, Joseph Brant, the man whose name young Thayendanegea would later carry in English. The forests were his first school. He learned to fish in the Mohawk River, to track deer through pine groves, to watch the flight of birds, to read the weather in the bend of the reeds and the hush of the wind. He listened as the elders spoke of alliances and old wars, the Beaver Wars, the French and Indian Wars, the treaties signed far away by men in red coats or powdered wigs. But while Thayendanegea was steeped in the ancient ways, the tide of empire was already lapping at the Longhouse door. The British and the French both coveted the land of the Six Nations. Traders came with muskets, iron pots, rum, and promises. Missionaries came with crosses and books. The Brant family stood at a crossroads of cultures. Thayendanegea's older sister, Molly Brant, known among her people as Konwatsitsyaeni, would become one of the most influential Mohawk women of her time. Through her relationship with Sir William Johnson, the powerful British superintendent of Indian affairs, the Brants would find themselves drawn into the orbit of empire. Johnson was no ordinary colonial official. He respected Mohawk customs, learned their language, and built trust among the Iroquois. For Thayendanegea, he was both a patron and a path to another world. Recognizing the boy's promise, Johnson arranged for him to attend Eleazar Wheelock's Moores Charity School for Indians in Connecticut, a missionary school dedicated to civilizing and Christianizing native youth. There, Joseph learned to read and write English, studied scripture, and translated prayers into Mohawk. Imagine this boy, barely a teenager, far from the smoke of his longhouse, sitting stiff-backed on a wooden bench in a cold New England schoolhouse, grappling with foreign words and alien beliefs. He learned the ways of Anglican missionaries, the doctrines of the Bible, the hymns of English churches, the speeches of British gentlemen. But he never abandoned the pulse of the forest, the stories of his clan, the unbroken chain that tied him to the Mohawk people. When Thayendanegea returned from the cold stone classrooms of Connecticut to the deep woods and broad rivers of the Mohawk Valley, he was no longer just a boy of the Longhouse. He was a man poised between worlds. fluent in the speech of colonial governors and the sacred songs of his people, comfortable at a British officer's dinner table and at a council fire beneath the stars. This balancing act, this burden, and this power would define the rest of his life. By the time Joseph Brant reached his early 20s, North America was once again a powder keg. The embers of an old conflict still glowed, the fierce contest between Britain and France for dominance over the vast lands of the interior. This was the French and Indian War, or, as Europeans called it, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. For the Iroquois, it was a storm at their door. Long masters of diplomacy, the Six Nations had long balanced French and British ambitions, playing one side against the other to preserve their autonomy. But by the 1750s, that balancing act was under siege. Young Brant did not shrink from the fight. He served under Sir William Johnson, the man who had opened the door to his English education, as an interpreter, a scout, and a warrior. He fought at the Battle of Lake George. He rode alongside Mohawk war parties who struck French settlements and outposts in upstate New York and beyond. He was no mere interpreter of words. He was an interpreter of worlds, carrying messages from the council, fires to British generals, and back again. Through this crucible, Thayendanegea learned what power looked like on the battlefield and how fragile alliances could be when gunpowder and promises collided. The war ended in Britain's favor, but the peace was a poisoned chalice. Victory meant new settlers pouring into lands the crown had promised to protect for the Iroquois. Treaties signed at distant tables did not stop surveyors from cutting lines through the forests or families from driving stakes into Mohawk hunting grounds. Brant saw clearly what many of his people feared. The British victory might be the death knell for the freedom of the longhouse. Yet Thayendanegea held to his loyalty. He believed that the British crown, with its vast resources, its kings and parliaments, was still the best chance to shield the Iroquois from the endless tide of colonial expansion. By the early 1770s, Joseph Brant was more than just a warrior. He was becoming a statesman. He married twice and fathered children. He worked as a translator for Anglican missionaries, helping to spread the gospel among his people while ensuring that Mohawk customs and governance did not vanish under English prayers. He traveled widely from Mohawk villages to colonial cities. He debated ministers and colonial officials. He translated the Book of Common Prayer and the Gospel of Mark into Mohawk, a task that, in his mind, did not betray his heritage but protected it, binding faith and culture together on his people's terms. He wore the red coat of a British officer on some occasions and the deerskin and feathered crest of a Mohawk war captain on others. His people saw him as a leader who could speak to the white world in its own tongue and remind the white world that the Iroquois were not children to be patronized, but sovereign nations with their own laws and iron traditions. Then came the spark that set the continent ablaze, the American Revolution. To the revolutionaries, the British were tyrants to be thrown off. To Brant, the rebels were land-hungry farmers who would shred treaties and scatter the Iroquois like leaves before a storm. In 1775, as shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, Joseph Brant sailed to England. He met King George III, not as a subject, but as a diplomat of the Mohawk nation. He explained, argued, and secured pledges of support for the Iroquois' cause. Imagine him there, a Mohawk warrior in London society, a curiosity at salons and dinner parties, a man in buckskins among silk coats. Yet no mere curiosity, a negotiator, a messenger carrying the voice of the forest into the heart of the empire. When he returned to America, war was raging. Brant chose his side, not for glory, not for gold, but for the survival of his people. He rallied Mohawk warriors and other Iroquois loyalists to the British cause. He led daring raids through the Mohawk Valley, striking rebel settlements, cutting supply lines, sowing fear among those who would drive his people from their lands. To American settlers, he became the Monster Brant, the phantom in the dark, the shadow in the woods, the threat whispered around hearth fires at night. To his people, he was Thayendanegea, the wolf who would not yield, the warrior who would not let the longhouse be trampled by the tide of revolution. But even as he waged war, Brant knew this fight was more than musket and tomahawk. He worked tirelessly to hold the fragile unity of the Six Nations together, a confederacy now divided as some Iroquois nations sided with the Americans and others with the crown. He wrote letters to generals and governors. He debated strategy with British commanders who too often saw the Iroquois as mere auxiliaries, tools rather than allies. He argued again and again for promises to be kept, land protected, treaties honored, his people's autonomy respected. In the forests and swamps, on river crossings and snow-choked trails, Joseph Brant fought not just for a king, but for a vision of a homeland that might yet survive the storm. A warrior of two worlds, a leader whose greatest weapon was not his musket or hatchet, but his voice, his pen, and the iron memory of the longhouse. And yet, even Thayendanegea could not hold back the tide forever. The revolution would not only redraw borders, it would redraw the very world his people knew. But even in defeat, this warrior of two worlds would find a way to carve out hope from the ashes of broken promises. By the late 1770s, the American Revolution had become more than a clash of redcoats and rebels. It had become a brutal frontier war that tore the Iroquois' homeland apart. And standing at the burning crossroads was Thayendanegea. Joseph Brant, leading men through forests turned to ash, rivers choked with ruin, and villages abandoned to ghosts. When Brant threw the weight of his name and his warriors behind the British, he gambled everything. He believed the Crown's promises, protection of Mohawk lands, recognition of Iroquois sovereignty, a buffer against the endless hunger for westward land that poured from rebel settlements like floodwaters through the valleys. But to fight for the British on the American frontier was to enter a war of smoke and flame, raids and counter-raids, reprisals that swallowed entire families, leaving behind charred fields and orphaned children. Brant understood that the war would not be won by grand armies alone, so he led small war parties, bands of Mohawk warriors and Loyalist rangers, slipping through forests to strike rebel outposts and homesteads. They hit supply lines, ambushed militias, spread fear that forced rebel settlers to stay behind palisades instead of pushing deeper into Iroquois land. To the patriot cause, Brant became a monster cloaked in feathers, a terrifying figure whose name alone stirred nightmares in frontier cabins. The war that unfolded on Iroquois ground was merciless. Atrocities bred atrocities. American frontier militias retaliated against the Iroquois, torching entire villages suspected of harboring Loyalist support. In 1779, General George Washington, hailed by some as the father of a new nation, ordered a scorched earth campaign to cripple the Iroquois Confederacy once and for all. It became known as the Sullivan-Clinton Expedition, a grim march through Iroquois' homelands where crops were burned, villages flattened, orchards cut down, stores of corn destroyed to starve entire communities through the harsh northern winters. Brant and his warriors fought skirmishes to slow the invaders, but the might of thousands of Continental troops left a path of ruin that could not be undone by arrows or gunfire. While flames rose from once thriving longhouses, thousands of Iroquois families fled north, seeking refuge near British forts along the Niagara and beyond. Many huddled in makeshift camps through brutal winters, dependent on the same British crown that now struggled to feed and arm its distant native allies. Disease spread in the refugee camps. Hunger gnawed at the proud warriors and their families. Yet Brant did not abandon them. He rode tirelessly between outposts and forts, petitioning British commanders for supplies, blankets, food, powder, muskets, anything to keep his people alive and ready to fight. Still, the deeper betrayal was not yet on the battlefield, but on the parchment that would come when the cannons fell silent. Brant believed, to the end, that the British would keep their word. He believed that when the final treaty was signed, the Iroquois who bled for the king would be rewarded, their villages rebuilt, their lands secured, their autonomy respected. But when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, it ended the war between Britain and the United States, but left Britain's native allies with nothing. No Mohawk sat at the treaty table, no Iroquois voice spoke over the ink and wax seals that redrew the borders of empires. Britain ceded vast tracts of territory, lands the Iroquois had called home for generations, to the new United States, with barely a line of ink acknowledging the people who lived on that ground. To the American victors, the Iroquois were simply the losers' allies, rebels' enemies, obstacles to be cleared away as the young republic flexed westward. To the British, the Iroquois were useful once, then forgotten, set aside in quiet shame as an inconvenient debt best left unpaid. Brant, who had once dined in London as a guest of the king, now faced the terrible truth. He had trusted an empire that could abandon him just as easily as it had once welcomed him. And yet, if you think the story ends here, with the Mohawk chief bowing his head in defeat, you do not yet know Thayendanegea. In the ashes of villages among the cold embers of broken promises, he saw something else. A chance to fight on, not with rifle and hatchet alone, but with paper, speech, and the iron will of a man who refused to let his people vanish into the pages of other men's history. A warrior turned diplomat, turned negotiator, turned founder of a new homeland. Brant's battle was far from over. As the young United States flexed its muscles and the British retreated across new borders, Brant carried his people northward, into a new chapter yet unwritten, a fight to carve out survival from betrayal, to build a future when the past was drenched in flame. And so the story of Thayendanegea moves forward, from burned longhouses to the new settlements along the Grand River, where a displaced nation would try to root itself once more. When the fires of the revolution died down, they left behind scorched earth, scattered villages, and a people torn from the lands of their ancestors. For the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, it was not just a military defeat, but a fracture in the sacred longhouse that bound them together. Families were divided, ancient council fires left cold, and for the Mohawk who had followed Joseph Brant into alliance with the crown, the betrayal was bitter. The British had promised protection, yet the treaty that ended the war gave away the Mohawk Valley as if no Mohawk feet had ever hunted its forests or buried their dead beneath its trees. But Thayendanegea did not stand idle among the ruins. A lesser leader might have accepted defeat, drifted into quiet bitterness, let his people fade away in refugee camps on the fringes of a new empire. Brant chose a different path. He traveled to London again in 1785, a seasoned diplomat now, no longer the curiosity he had been in his youth. He met with King George III once more, with lords and members of Parliament, insisting they honor the alliance forged in blood. He reminded them of Mohawk loyalty when it counted most, when redcoat banners were tattered on distant battlefields and few allies remained. And in that faraway capital, Thayendanegea secured what would become his people's new lifeline, land. In what was then called Upper Canada, part of the vast province of Quebec, the British Crown granted Brant and his followers a tract along the Grand River near Lake Ontario. Here, far from the charred remains of the Mohawk Valley, the Mohawk would build again. Some saw it as compensation, others as a bribe to keep a powerful man loyal in the uncertain balance of post-war North America. But to Brant, it was something else entirely. Not a handout, but a foothold for survival. In 1784, Joseph Brant led nearly 2,000 Iroquois Loyalists, mostly Mohawk families, but also some Cayuga, Onondaga, and others, northward through forests and over rivers, carrying what little they could on their backs and in their canoes. These families were not simply moving. They were transplanting centuries of memory, law, and identity to a new ground. They would rebuild their council fires. They would plant new cornfields and raise new longhouses. They would carve a homeland from wilderness once again, but now under the wary eye of the British Empire, which still watched the Iroquois as both valuable allies and dangerous reminders of broken promises. Ever the bridge between two worlds, turned this raw settlement into a model of balance. He encouraged agriculture and trade with British merchants. He invited Anglican missionaries to build churches and schools, but on Mohawk terms. He secured millstones and blacksmiths, sawmills, and farms. He used his voice and his pen, skills learned in those cold Connecticut schoolrooms long ago, to advocate for the rights of his people. He traveled to Quebec City and back to London again, pressing the crown for deeds, patents, clear boundaries that could not be stripped away by scheming colonial officials or land-hungry settlers. Yet Thayendanegea never forgot that he was, above all, a Mohawk leader, not a puppet of the British Empire. He balanced the new with the old, urging his people to keep their clan mothers, their councils, their ceremonies, even as they learned to read English prayers and navigate European courts. To many, he seemed a contradiction. The Mohawk chief who wore a British officer's coat, the fierce warrior who translated the Gospel of Mark into Mohawk, the diplomat who negotiated land deeds with quill and parchment, then led hunting parties deep into the forest to teach young men the old ways. Not everyone agreed with him. Some within the Iroquois Confederacy resented his power and the influence he wielded with British officials. Others whispered that he had traded too much, that to win favor with the empire, he risked diluting the very traditions he claimed to protect. Brant heard these murmurs, but stayed his course. He knew that survival in this new world meant mastering both the forest and the courtroom. It meant teaching Mohawk boys to trap and track, and to read, write, and argue treaties line by line. Throughout the 1790s, Brant worked tirelessly. He acted as chief, judge, diplomat, and sometimes enforcer of order among the Grand River communities. He pushed back against encroaching settlers and shady land speculators. He visited Philadelphia to meet with George Washington, now the president of the very republic whose birth had scorched his homeland, hoping to secure recognition of Iroquois sovereignty from both sides of the border. Brant even dreamed of something bigger, a united Indigenous Confederacy stretching across the Great Lakes, strong enough to hold the line against the insatiable appetite of the American frontier. But this dream, like so many, was battered by internal divisions, shifting alliances, and the cold calculation of empires that saw land as profit and promises as expendable. Yet for all the betrayals, Thayendanegea did not waver in building something lasting. He established a church, a school, a council house. He insisted that his people remain Mohawk first, even as they adapted to the machinery of empire. He urged them to hold fast to the great law of peace, that ancient bond that had tied the Six Nations together long before Europeans crossed the sea. And through it all, the Grand River settlement, born of exile and loss, became a new hearth for the Mohawk, a place where the embers of their nation could burn on, even as the forests of New York slipped forever beyond their reach. In the final stretch of his life, Joseph Brant stood at the edge of 2 centuries and 2 worlds. A warrior still, but now also a patriarch, a negotiator, and for his people, a stubborn, tireless guardian of a fragile promise that the longhouse would not fall so long as breath and memory remained. By the dawn of the 19th century, the forests where Thayendanegea once hunted as a boy were far behind him, replaced by the winding Grand River and the new settlements he carved from wilderness with will alone. He was no longer the young war captain who struck terror into rebel homesteads, nor the bright-eyed student at Moore's charity school translating prayers into Mohawk. He had become something rarer, an aging warrior who had survived the storms of empire, whose name carried both fear and grudging respect in London drawing rooms, on colonial frontiers, and in the smoke of Mohawk council fires. He watched new generations grow up along the Grand River, children who had never seen the Mohawk Valley of their ancestors, who only knew its rivers and forests through the stories their elders told by firelight. He spent his days traveling endlessly between his new homeland and the cities that surrounded it. To Quebec City, where British governors weighed promises like coins. To Philadelphia and Albany, where American officials eyed the Iroquois like an obstacle to be pushed aside, or a threat to be disarmed with ink and quill. He fought legal battles as fiercely as he once led war parties. He pressed the British for titles and deeds to secure Grand River land against land speculators who saw the new Mohawk settlement as ripe for quiet theft. He negotiated tirelessly, warning both Crown and Congress that a people stripped of land would not vanish peacefully. And yet even Brant could not stop the tide forever. The dream of a united Indigenous Confederacy that might stand firm against the young American Republic flickered and faltered. Many nations were divided, some willing to sign treaties in exchange for shaky promises, some resigned to retreat, some determined to fight to the last musket ball. Brant watched the creeping reality settle in. The old world was gone. The longhouse still stood, but the land beneath it grew narrower each passing year. Still, he refused despair. He turned his gaze to the next generation. He taught his sons and daughters the old ways, but also English law, the politics of diplomacy, the delicate art of survival when surrounded by men who saw your existence as an inconvenience. He still hunted when he could, though the forests were thinner now, the deer scarcer. His once vigorous frame bore the weight of age and old wounds. but when he spoke, the fire had not dimmed. His voice could still hush a gathering with its gravity and remind the powerful that the Mohawk were not a relic to be swept aside. And then, in November of 1807, the warrior's time drew to its end. He fell ill at his home, surrounded by family and loyal followers. Some accounts say he suffered from a painful disease, worsened by years of harsh winters, battlefield injuries, and relentless travel. As death crept closer, he did not rage or shrink away. Instead, he gathered those he trusted. He spoke softly, softly, the same man who once roared battle cries into the forests, now whispering final counsel for the world he would leave behind. One story, likely polished by the memory of those who loved him, says that in those last moments he turned to his people and said, "Have pity on the poor Indians. If you have any influence with the great, endeavor to use it for their good." In that single plea lay the burden of his life, to stand guard for a people whose home had been broken, but whose spirit would not surrender. Joseph Brant died on November 24th, 1807, at about 64 years old, an old age for a man who had survived wars, smallpox, betrayal, and the bitter weight of leadership. He was buried at his Grand River home, far from the Mohawk Valley of his birth, yet close to the people he had led through fire and exile, hunger and hope. In 1850, his remains were moved to a chapel in what is now Brantford, Ontario, a town that still bears his name. On that soil, he lies beneath stones that remember him in both languages, English and Mohawk, a testament to the bridge he built, however imperfect, between a world that vanished and a world that still endures. A warrior, a translator, a negotiator, a lion who would not let the longhouse fall quietly into the darkness. In death, as in life, Thayendanegea, Joseph Brant, remains a reminder that the battle to protect a people's memory is never truly lost, so long as someone remembers the name and speaks the story. Thayendanegea, Joseph Brant, was a man of contradictions, a warrior who studied scripture, a diplomat who led raids through burning villages, a Mohawk chief who dined with kings and debated in parliament. To his people, he was a shield against the storm of empire. To his enemies, he was the monster Brant, the ghost in the dark forests of the American frontier. But above all, he was a leader who refused to vanish quietly beneath the waves of history. Today, his descendants and the people of the Six Nations still hold his memory, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the fight to protect a people, a culture, and a homeland never truly ends. Thank you for walking these shadowed trails with me tonight. I am the Duke of New York, and this was Faces of History. Until next time.